All right, so welcome to our lecture on how states spatially organize their governments. The slides are designed to accompany the book People, Places, and Culture. I am, of course, Miss Gall, and I'll be your host for the lecture. So just a quick reminder, every time you hear that word state, I want you to think country. Okay, the only place where we call our subnational units states for the most part is the United States. I think India actually does it too, but most places they call them something like provinces. So just remember every time you see that word states, I want you to think countries. So the first thing we got to talk about, we talk about how states are organized, is we need to talk about the forces within a state that either pull it together or push it apart. Okay, and these are centripetal forces and centrifugal forces. If you've studied any physics at all in science, probably say last year, you probably learned a little bit about centripetal and centrifugal forces. Okay, centripetal with a P, these are the forces that pull people together, that make them feel like they share something in common. All right, so they're what unify the people. Forces that divide them are centrifugal forces. Okay, and the way I was taught to remember this when I was in school and learning about it in physics class in high school was to think about centrifugal being like when you swing a bucket full of water around. The reason why the water doesn't pull out is because it's got that centrifugal force pulling it into the bottom of the bucket. Okay, so it's pulling things out, pulling things apart. And whether or not a state continues to exist really depends on that balance between centripetal and centrifugal forces. And these are tricky things to think about. They're a little bit like push and pull factors in that something that's a centripetal force in one situation can be a centrifugal force in another situation. Like for example, ethnicity. Right? So if you have a nation state like say Japan, then nationality or ethnicity is a centripetal force. It unifies the people. On the other hand, if you've got a multi-nation state, like say Iraq, right, then it becomes a centrifugal force where you've got the Kurds kind of trying to pull away because they're a different ethnicity, and you've got the Sunni and the Shia kind of trying to pull apart, and you can argue about whether or not they're a different ethnicity. I would think that they probably are, given some of their differences, but certainly you could make that argument. But either way, it's a centrifugal force. It's kind of pulling people apart. So once we kind of understand how governments stay together, how governments fall apart, then we can start to talk about different types of government, different forms of government. Okay, unitary governments are governments where the national government is not only, I mean, national government's always going to be the most important, but where national governments don't share power. Okay, so the framework of the government is designed to make sure that the central government has authority over all of the country. Britain is a classic example of this, although they're in the process of devolving their power. All right, but Britain's probably the number one cited example of this. Federal systems, on the other hand, federal systems are what we live with here in the United States, okay, are systems in which regions have a lot of control over government policies and funds, particularly as they're applied locally, right? And even in a weak federal system, the central government still retains a lot of power, right? So our system is our federal system. Really, we call it federalism, right? And ism is that, so it would be the belief in a federal system. It helps to accommodate regional interests by keeping government close to the people. Okay, so it allows for there's certain commonalities in belief that we should all share and certain common goals that we should try to reach, but it also says, you know, how Washington's going to do it is a little bit different than how Oregon's going to do it, is a little bit different than how California's going to do it, is different than Boston or New York, right? So essentially what happens is that government is as close to the people as it can be. So there's certain things that for us to be a country, right, the states can't do. Washington State can't make a treaty with another country, right? That needs to be at the federal level. Washington State can't go to war with another country. That's something that needs to be handled with the central government, with the federal government, right? So as much as they can, though, power is given to the provinces or states, right? Or other regional units. The process of giving that power to states is called devolution. Okay, and devolution is when we move power from a strong central government to regional governments within a state. And this is what's actually happening in Britain right now. It's pretty interesting to watch, because what's essentially happening is this second bullet point here, where the Constitution in Britain doesn't have a formal written constitution, so it's more like kind of how they agree they're going to govern themselves, right? But the Constitution is reworked to establish more of a federal system that recognizes the permanency of those regional governments. And in Britain, it's going on in a few different ways, right? So in the United Kingdom, it's actually the United Kingdom of Britain, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And each of those different territories has its own regional government with varying amounts of power, right? So they're shifting power to those regional governments. What's also happening in Britain, though, that makes this even more interesting is they're increasingly encouraging cities to step up. And when you've got a bunch of cities that are kind of in basically the same area, to start sharing authority and to come together to control some of their some of the funds that would go to the city to work towards, say, to cover the costs of, say, healthcare and social work. And so cities could work to combine those, for example, and try to provide people the resources they need for, say, mental illness, so that it doesn't manifest itself physically, right? So that's just one example. In other places, what you've got are governments that devolve power, that take power away from the center, but they do it without altering their constitutions. It's almost like an experiment. They give it a try and see how it goes, but they don't permanently change the system, so that at any time you could adjust that and fix it as needed. So we're going to move on to our next topic here, and we're going to talk a little bit about electoral geography. Okay, and the basics of electoral geography are that we partition the territory of a country into electoral districts. We do this here in the United States all the time, right? So in the United States, we've got our congressional districts, right? And congressional districts really are for the House of Representatives. And so Washington State, I forget how many we've got. I think there's 8 or 9 congressional districts, right? So we've split Washington State into these different electoral districts, right? We also, for example, split Washington State into different electoral districts to elect to the state house. We could talk about partitioning the country territory into electoral districts for the Senate, and those Senate seats are 2 per state, so then the state becomes the electoral district, right? And electoral geographers work examining how the spatial configuration of electoral districts and voting patterns can then influence the outcome of elections and ultimately social and political affairs. All right, so the example they give is in 1994 in South Africa, and that was the year that South Africa decided to finally allow blacks to vote, and specifically to allow the African National Congress to run. So they had to reconfigure all of their electoral districts to account for it, right? And there's a whole field of political science that is just dedicated to electoral geography. And what they do is they study the patterns of voting behavior in order to, so if we're talking about people whose main focus is the geography piece, they look at how geographic situation then influences voting behavior. Right, and I used to know a guy when I was in graduate school getting my degree in political science who literally could predict with somewhere around 90+% accuracy how you would vote, and all he needed to know was where you lived, your gender, I think it was your gender, your ethnicity, and your age. Basically, those handful of things, and he could predict with a pretty fair amount of accuracy how you were likely to vote in any given election. Um, so once we've got these set up, periodically we have to adjust them. We call that adjustment reapportionment. Okay, and reapportionment, it just means that we're going to shift those districts to account for population districts. And in the United States, at the federal level, we do this every 10 years with the census, right? So for instance, when in about 2010, there was some talk because there was a seat eliminated in Ohio, a House of Representatives seat that was then shifted to Washington State, and the guy from Ohio, Dennis Kucinich, was talking about moving to Washington and running for his old seat, only now, of course, from Washington State. So, um, this has been our lecture a little bit about how states spatially organize their governments, and we've talked a little bit about electoral geography and done some introduction there. We've talked about centripetal and centrifugal forces and what those are and how those work. And we've also talked about different structures of government, different generalized structures of government, talked about unitary governments versus federal governments. So if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. Please just bring them into class and I'll see you the next time we meet.